sort of a girl," she said. "A very pushing little person." "I—" Mildred began, and after hesitating concluded, "I rather dropped her." "Fortunate you've done so," her father remarked, cheerfully. "Especially since various members of the Lamb connection are here frequently. They mightn't think you'd shown a great deal of tact in having her about the place." He laughed and turned to his cousin. "All this isn't very interesting to poor Arthur. How terrible people are with a newcomer in town! They talk as if he knew all about everybody." "But we don't know anything about these queer people ourselves," said Mrs. Palmer. "We know something about the girl, of course. She used to be a bit too conspicuous, in fact. However, as you say, we might find a subject more interesting for Arthur." She smiled whimsically upon the young man. "Tell the truth," she said. "Don't you fairly detest going into business with that tyrant yonder?" "What? Yes, I beg your pardon," he stammered. "You were right," Mrs. Palmer said to her husband. "You've bored him so, talking about thievish clerks, he can't even answer an honest question." But Russell was beginning to recover his outward composure. "Try me again," he said. "I'm afraid I was thinking of something else." This was the best he found to say. There was a part of him that wanted to protest and deny, but he had not heat enough in the chill that had come upon him. Here was the first mention of Alice, and with it the reason why it was the first. Mr. Palmer had difficulty in recalling her, and she had happened to be spoken of only because her father's betrayal of a benefactor's trust had been so particularly atrocious that in the view of the benefactor's family it contained enough of the element of humour to warrant a mild laugh at a club. There was the deadliness of the story, its lack of malice, even of resentment. Deadlier still were Mrs. Palmer's phrases: "a pushing sort of girl," "a very pushing little person," and "used to be a bit too conspicuous, in fact." But she spoke placidly and by chance, being as obviously without unkindly motive as Mr. Palmer was when he related the cause of Alfred Lamb's amusement. Her opinion of the obscure young lady momentarily her topic had been expressed, moreover, to her husband, and at her own table. She sat there, large, kind, serene; a protest might astonish but could not change her; and Russell, crumpling in his strained fingers the lace-edged little web of a napkin upon his knee, found heart enough to grow red, but not enough to challenge her. She noticed his colour and attributed it to the embarrassment of a scrupulously gallant gentleman caught in a lapse of attention to a lady. "Don't be disturbed," she said, benevolently. "People aren't expected to listen all the time to their relatives. A high colour is very becoming to you, Arthur, but it really isn't necessary between cousins. You can always be informal enough with us to listen only when you care to." His complexion continued to be ruddier than usual, however, throughout the meal, and was still somewhat tinted when Mrs. Palmer rose. "The man's bringing you cigarettes here," she said, nodding to the two gentlemen. "We'll give you a chance to do the sordid kind of talking we know you really like. After a while Mildred will show you what's in bloom in the hothouse, if you wish, Arthur." Mildred followed her, and when they were alone in another of the spacious rooms, went to a window and looked out, while her mother seated herself near the centre of the room in a gilt armchair mellowed with old tapestry. Mrs. Palmer looked thoughtfully at her daughter's back, but did not speak until her coffee had been brought for them. "Thanks," Mildred said, not turning. "I don't care for any coffee, I believe." "No?" Mrs. Palmer said, gently. "I'm afraid our good-looking cousin won't think you're very talkative, Mildred. You spoke only about twice at lunch. I shouldn't care for him to get the idea you're piqued because he's come here so little lately, should you?" "No, I shouldn't," Mildred answered in a low voice, and with that she turned quickly and came to sit near her mother. "But it's what I am afraid of. Mama, did you notice how red he got?" "You mean when he was caught not listening to a question of mine? Yes, it's very becoming to him." "Mama, I don't think that was the reason. I don't think it was because he wasn't listening, I mean." "No?" "I think his colour and his not listening came from the same reason," Mildred said, and although she had come to sit near her mother, she did not look at her. "I think it happened because you and Papa—" She stopped. "Yes?" Mrs. Palmer said, good-naturedly, to prompt her. "Your father and I did something embarrassing?" "Mama, it was because of those things that came out about Alice Adams." "How could that bother Arthur? Does he know her?" "Don't you remember?" the daughter asked. "The day after my dance I mentioned how odd I thought it was in him. I was a little disappointed in him. I'd been seeing that he met everybody, of course, but she was the only girl he asked to meet, and he did it as soon as he noticed her. I hadn't meant to have him meet her; in fact, I was rather sorry I'd felt I had to ask her, because oh, well, she's the sort that tries for the new man, if she has half a chance, and sometimes they seem quite fascinated. For a time, that is. I thought Arthur was above all that, or at the very least I gave him credit for being too sophisticated." "I see," Mrs. Palmer said, thoughtfully. "I remember now that you spoke of it. You said it seemed a little peculiar, but of course it really wasn't. A new man has nothing to go by except his own first impressions. You can't blame poor Arthur. She's quite a piquant-looking little person. You think he's seen something of her since then?" Mildred nodded slowly. "I never dreamed such a thing till yesterday, and even then I rather doubted it, till he got so red just now. I was surprised when he asked to meet her, but he just danced with her once and didn't mention her afterward. I forgot all about it. In fact, I virtually forgot all about her. I've seen quite a little of her." "Yes," said Mrs. Palmer. "She did keep coming here." "But I'd just about decided that it really wouldn't do," Mildred went on. "She isn't well, I didn't admire her." "No," her mother assented, and evidently followed a direct connection of thought in a speech apparently irrelevant. "I understand the young Malone wants to marry Henrietta. I hope she won't. He seems rather a gross type of person." "Oh, he's just the one," Mildred said. "I don't know that he and Alice Adams were ever engaged. She never told me so. She may not have been engaged to any of them. She was just enough among the other girls to get talked about, and one of the reasons I felt a little inclined to be nice to her was that they seemed to be rather edging her out of the circle. It wasn't long before I saw they were right, though. I happened to mention I was going to give a dance, and she pretended to take it as a matter of course that I meant to invite her brother. At least, I thought she pretended. She might really have believed it. At any rate, I had to send him a card, but I didn't intend to be let in for that sort of thing again, of course. She's what you said, pushing, though I'm awfully sorry you said it." "Why shouldn't I have said it, my dear?" "Of course I didn't say 'shouldn't,'" Mildred explained gravely. "I meant only that I'm sorry it happened." "Yes, but why?" "Mama," Mildred turned to her, leaning forward and speaking in a lowered voice. "Mama, at first the change was so little it seemed as if Arthur hardly knew it himself. He'd been lovely to me, as always, and he was still lovely to me, but oh, well, you've understood. After my dance it was more as if it was just his nature and his training to be lovely to me, as he would be to everyone, a kind of politeness. He had never said he cared for me, but after that I could see he didn't. It was clear after that. I didn't know what had happened. I couldn't think of anything I'd done. Mama, it was Alice Adams." Mrs. Palmer set her little coffee cup upon the table beside her, calmly following her own motion with her eyes, and not seeming to realize with what serious entreaty her daughter's gaze was fixed upon her. Mildred repeated the last sentence of her revelation, and introduced a stress of insistence. "Mama, it was Alice Adams." But Mrs. Palmer declined to be greatly impressed, so far as her appearance went at least, and to emphasize her refusal she smiled indulgently. "What makes you think so?" "Henrietta told me yesterday." At this Mrs. Palmer permitted herself to laugh softly aloud. "Good heavens! Is Henrietta a soothsayer? Or is she Arthur's particular confidante?" "No, Ella Dowling told her." Mrs. Palmer's laughter continued. "Now we have it!" she exclaimed. "It's a game of gossip. Arthur tells Ella, Ella tells Henrietta, and Henrietta tells—" "Don't laugh, please, Mama," Mildred begged. "Of course Arthur didn't tell anybody. It's roundabout enough, but it's true. I know it. I hadn't quite believed it, but I knew it was true when he got so red. He looked for a second or so he looked stricken. He thought I didn't notice it, Mama. He's been to see her almost every evening lately. They take long walks together. That's why he hasn't been here." Of Mrs. Palmer's laughter there was left only her indulgent smile, which she had not allowed to vanish. "Well, what of it?" she said. "Mama!" "Yes," said Mrs. Palmer. "What of it?" "But don't you see?" Mildred's well-tutored voice, though modulated and repressed even in her present emotion, nevertheless had a tendency to quaver. "It's true. Frank Dowling was going to see her one evening, and he saw Arthur sitting on the stoop with her, and didn't go in. And Ella used to go to school with a girl who lives across the street from her. She told Ella—" "Oh, I understand," Mrs. Palmer interrupted. "Suppose he does go there?" "My dear, I said, what of it?" "I don't see what you mean, Mama. I'm so afraid he might think we knew about it, and that you and Papa said those things about her and her father on that account, as if we abused them because he goes there instead of coming here." "Nonsense!" Mrs. Palmer rose, went to a window, and, turning there, stood with her back to it, facing her daughter, and looking at her cheerfully. "Nonsense, my dear! It was perfectly clear that she was mentioned by accident, and so was her father. What an extraordinary man! If Arthur makes friends with people like that, he certainly knows better than to expect to hear favourable opinions of them. Besides, it's only a little passing thing with him." "Mama, when he goes there almost every—" "Yes," Mrs. Palmer said, dryly. "It seems to me I've heard somewhere that other young men have gone there almost every—" She doesn't last, apparently. Arthur is gallant, and he's impressionable, but he's fastidious, and fastidiousness is always the check on impressionableness.